It's a real honor and privilege for me to be able to engage with Professor Mary Beltrán and really to have had a chance to really look at her book and read it thoroughly. So let me tell you a little bit about her, give you her bio. She is an associate professor of radio, television, film, and a faculty affiliate of Mexican American and Latino Studies and Women and Gender Studies at the University of Texas at Austin. She specializes in critical studies driven scholarship at the intersection of film and television studies, Latino and Latina and ethnic studies and gender studies. So her work is informed by her prior careers as a journalist and a social worker. She writes and teaches on race, class, gender, and the U.S. media industries and U.S. television and film history, with an emphasis on U.S. Latino and Latina representation and authorship. She is the author of Latino Stars in U.S. Eyes, The Making and Meanings of Film and TV Stardom. She's also the co-editor of Mixed Race Hollywood and author of the newly released Latino TV, A History, which is the book that we're discussing today. Dr. Beltrán is Associate Director also of the Latino Media and Arts and Studies program at UT Austin Moody College of Communication. And so without further ado, I'd like to turn this over then to Professor Beltrán to tell us about her book.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Moya, for that really kind introduction. And I want to thank the Center for the Study of Race and Ethnicity in America, and particularly Dr. Leroux and Dr. Rose, and the staff who are helping to make this event possible: Maggie Murphy, Ellie Winter, Trey Alston Swan, and Hannah, who just handled a little bit of a tricky media issue and is our media maven behind the scenes. And I'm just really honored to be able to share my work with everyone today. Thank you also for people who are out there in the audience. If we could bring the slides up. Thank you so much, Hannah. I want to begin with a brief disclaimer that Latino TV history is a history. It's not the history of Hispanics and Latinos in English language television and behind the scenes in the TV industry. There's so much I couldn't explore in order to write a somewhat cohesive narrative that I could share, to not simply create an encyclopedia of various series and pilots produced over the years. Let's see, next slide, please. I began the research that became Latino TV history actually about 22 years ago when I was a doctoral student in a graduate seminar with Horace Newcomb, one of the many inspiring faculty that I had at the University of Texas at Austin, where I got my PhD. And I had a lot of questions and very few answers at that time. I was really interested in the fact that there was, that Latinos in the United States were really growing as a population and becoming the largest non-white ethnic group in the United States. And in the meanwhile, Latinas and Latinos were still, and actually often, for the most part, often still are, quite invisible in the television landscape. There also was beginning to be early scholarship on African Americans in television. And I include here some of the books that have been published in the last few decades. And this work was just beginning in the late 1990s and 2000s. But for Latinos in television, there really have not been books of these sorts. There have been individual studies here and there. And so, in fact, my seminar paper back then wasn't great, and I put it aside. And I mean, maybe it was okay. It's hard to say, but I realized at that point there were so many interwoven threads that were part of the dynamic that resulted in invisibility for Latinos in television, and I just couldn't fully understand all of them at the time. But the spark started there. It was, but I kept waiting for someone else to do this project because it was daunting. It was such a massive project to take on, to try to trace what had happened since the 1950s until recent years. Finally, about 6 years ago, I decided I just needed to take the plunge, and I began to do the research that became this book. Next slide, please. I was interested in representation, but even more in how the television industry has viewed Latinidad or Latinness in relation to national identities, and in how Latinos have begun to find a place in the industry and have an impact on Latino and Latina TV narratives. For this reason, my research included doing as many interviews as I could with Latina and Latino media professionals who worked in television, who had worked in television going back as far as I could find those professionals, and especially writers I wanted to focus on. And so my research included interviews and also archival research and industry research on relevant series. Those interviews were both humbling and inspiring, as Latino creatives have had to work within an environment that was often soul-crushing. And they are really the heroes and the heroines of this book. And so I began my approach, let's see, next slide. Again, my approach then, looking at a number of Latinx-focused series that were promoted and produced in a manner that undercut their potential, that often undercut their potential to showcase Latina and Latino perspectives. I was searching for traces of these productions, and a central concept that guided me was cultural citizenship, as described by scholars such as Renato Rosaldo, the dynamic of having a voice and visibility in larger society in relation to our cultural identity and the social groups that we belong to. With this in mind, being represented and telling our stories via television is a powerful aspect of cultural citizenship. I build here also on Gloria Anzaldua's concept of haciendo caras, or making faces. The idea of like, who gets to make our face? Do we get to make our own face, or do others get to decide what we look like and to describe us and to construct us within popular culture? And so much of what I'm trying to do is explore how Latina and Latino cultural laborers work to tell their stories and our stories, and also to use the term making faces, a slightly different concept, or to resist through our creative expression when necessary as well. Slide. In relation to this, one of my central areas of focus, as I mentioned earlier, is the rise of Latino and Latina television writing and producing over the decades, beginning for the most part in the late 1960s. And the image that's on the top of the slide here is from like around 1969. And ultimately, television storytelling as embodied in show running, Latinx showrunners since the late 1990s and 2000s. And the image here at the bottom of the slide is Tanya Saracho, who was the showrunner of the series Vida, which ran on Stars from 2018 to 2020. In my introduction, I lay out the significance of cultural citizenship via television storytelling and how Latinxes have faced challenges in participating. I use Hector Amaya's concept of citizenship excess, with Latinos holding the shorter end of the stick of this concept in this regard, and draw attention throughout the book to how Latinos gaining access to higher education and entrees into the industry has begun to tip the balance toward storytelling and cultural citizenship of Latinos in the TV industry. The following chapters each explore a distinct period in television. Next slide, please. My 1950s chapter is focused squarely on representation, as Latinos, for the most part, were not yet working as creatives behind the scenes. So I look at representation and the forging of patterns of representation that influence later decades. In kids' TV westerns and adventure series featuring Latino and Latina characters, such as the Cisco Kid and the 9 Lives of El Fuego Baca, the first TV series based on a real-life Mexican-American hero. And I also look at Disneyland's Frontierland, which featured a number of kids' TV Western characters and recreations of Western stories in children's play. I trace how television taught viewers lessons in discerning so-called good Latinos from so-called bad Latinos, and how Mexican-American history is erased in these and other TV Westerns. I also found in Hanna-Barbera's Quick Draw McGraw and Baba Louie, of all places, from the Quick Draw McGraw show, that these ideas were sometimes subverted, speaking to the counter-hegemonic potential of satire targeting adults and kids, even in the late 1950s. Next slide. The next chapter traces the rise of Chicano and Nuyorican programming on local public television and a few commercial TV stations in Los Angeles, New York, and a handful of other cities, including public stations in San Antonio, Phoenix, and Boston in the late 1960s and early 1970s. Many of these series were led by activists who turned to television as a way to reach and inspire their community members. This included the first bilingual Mexican-American family drama, and that is the photo that's featured on the bottom left is from that show, Canción de la Raza, produced at KCET in Los Angeles. I also found that there were a range of public affairs news series that aim to educate and support local communities and civil rights efforts, offering training and an entree to the first generation of Latino television producers. Next slide. I then turned to narrative programming on the commercial networks in the next 2 chapters, on programming in the 1970s, as I show here. And next slide, I guess. Yes, I'm jumping ahead already. And then programming in the 1980s and 90s. This is a time when Chicano and Latino advocacy groups were putting pressure on the networks to air at least one Latino-focused series in the primetime lineup. But when networks and series producers typically were not concerned with hiring Latino or Latina writers to help develop these series. With the success of Chico and the Man in the 1970s and Freddie Prinze's resulting stardom, the networks began to be vaguely interested and inspired by the possibility of Latino or Latina TV stardom. But series leads in later decades, like A.K.A. Pablo's Paul Rodriguez, featured in the middle bottom photo here. He's in the red plaid shirt. And another potential Latino star, according to the networks, was Maria Conchita Alonso, who's featured in the photo at the bottom right. And she had been in a few major films in minor roles, and they decided to give her a shot at a TV show, which was called Just One of the Boys. But I found that within these years that Alonso and Paul Rodriguez and others were still marketed to the American public in rigid and frankly stereotypical ways that made evident the obstacles to achieving more nuanced and culturally sincere Latino storytelling in this era. I'll return actually in a bit to delve more deeply into this chapter on the failed series and pilots of the 1980s and 1990s. Slide, please. And finally, I turn to explore Latino TV as Latinx cultural citizenship is beginning to be felt in the US in the late 90s and the first decade of the new millennium. For one, Latinos had grown dramatically as a television audience. By the 2000s, a small number of Latino and Latina professionals were working as staff writers in television, and the first Latino creators and executive producers had a chance to produce their own series. These showrunners had to pull off a major balancing act in pleasing their networks and Latino and non-Latino viewers, while also remaining true to their own vision. In Chapter 5, I investigate the conception and production of 3 particularly influential series: Resurrection Boulevard, which is featured in the top right photo, helmed by Dennis Leone of Mexican and Italian descent; George Lopez, which was executive produced in part by its eponymous Mexican-American star; and Ugly Betty, which was created and executive produced or co-executive produced by the late Silvio Horta of Cuban-American descent, with respect to how they created narratives that appealed to a wide variety of viewers to be successful, that drew on their own personal cultural histories and experiences. Slide. The final chapter is set only a decade later, the 2010s, but reflects new possibilities for Latino and Latinx cultural production and television. In these years, Latinas led a wave of programming that was culturally specific and intimate. These series include One Day at a Time, Vida, Gentified, and Los Spookies. In The Latino Wave and Other Trends, I explore the impact of 3 writer showrunners, specifically Cristela Alonso, who's featured at the top left in the picture there, who was writer, producer, and star of a series called Cristela on ABC. Gloria Calderon Kellett, co-showrunner with Norman Lear of One Day at a Time, and Tanya Saracho, creator and executive producer of Vida. And all of these narratives I found included feminist and culturally resistant content in a way that we really haven't witnessed in English language television prior to this. I also examine how these 3 media professionals have made mentorship and industry change a priority in their careers. My conclusion grapples with the ongoing battle for cultural citizenship as Latina and Latino creatives and television professionals are calling attention to how Latinos are typically still marginalized in the industry, as well as calling for reforms and enacting their own interventions to begin to change this industry paradigm that has excluded Latinx voices. Like these media professionals, I find hope in the new storytellers who are just beginning to put their voices and stories out there. And I'll turn here now to share in more depth on one chapter on 80s and 90s network failures and lessons about Latinidad as constructed on broadcast network television in these years. And it's going to be a bit depressing, I should warn you. After I do that, I'm going to bring in a little bit about the 2010s so that we can hopefully we can end on a more optimistic note when I wrap up. Next slide, please. Paul Rodriguez's 2017 play, The Pitch, or How to Pitch a Latino Sitcom That Will Never Air, at the Los Angeles Theater Center in 2017, included Lalo Guerrero's Rye song, No Chicanos on TV, as part of its opening. Hannah, if you could play a little bit from the song, that'd be great.
I think that I shall never see any Chicanos on TV. It seems as though we don't exist, and we're not ever even missed. And yet we buy and buy their wares, but no Chicanos anywhere. The situation comedies, the the Jeffersons and the Cosbys. Just change the channel and you'll get Arnold and Webster on the set. Their TV families are white, but not a Mexican in sight.
Time, I guess we should stop there.
There are
Okay, it is on YouTube. This was a song that as I said, the late Lalo Guerrero, he first publicly sang it in the 1990s. And so that's why he's talking about some older series. But unfortunately, it still can be applicable. And so this was the beginning of Rodriguez's play. And it was perhaps the play's most lighthearted moment. The pitch depicted the challenges of pitching a series about Latino characters and weathering the reception from network executives of flattery, stalling, and ultimate rejection. As Rodriguez said in an interview after I watched the production, it aimed to skewer the injustice and absurdity of this soul-crushing cycle. Rodriguez and his co-stars, Mike Gomez and John Lopez, playing his real-life son, Paul Rodriguez Jr., who some people may know as P-Rod to his skateboarding fans. They reenact the many pitch meetings he had attended at the Big Four networks. The trio is left endlessly sitting in waiting rooms as receptionists and entry-level staff offer them beverages and make lame excuses for their boss's delays, and in some cases, actual absence from the building or the city. The audience also witnesses development meetings in which cultural misinformation about Latinos resulting in insulting suggestions, and in which Rodriguez and his team are presumed incapable of taking the lead in writing and producing the series that they've created. In the end, as Guerrero's song intimates, nothing results from the meetings, and there are still no Chicanos or Latinos on TV. The pitch offered a glimpse into network programming development that few Latinos could know. 33 years earlier, Rodriguez, then an up-and-coming comedian, had been promoted as the next Freddie Prinze when he was cast in the sitcom AKA Pablo, which aired on ABC in 1984. It was Norman Lear's first Latino series to make it to broadcast. Because of this pedigree, AKA Pablo got more promotion than most series with Latino stars, but it wasn't renewed after its truncated six-episode run. When two other series in which he later co-starred were also short-lived, Rodriguez turned to stand-up comedy and a career in smaller roles in films and television. His experience was representative of missteps that were commonly made in the 80s and 90s when networks made attempts at Latino-centric programming. In these years, about a dozen series with a Latino or Latina lead character progressed from the nebulous stage of development to air as a pilot or a partial or full season of episodes. Very few Latino professionals were involved in their conception and production, and none in leadership roles. Notably, all but one of these series were situation comedies, half-hour series shot on a set, and thus low-budget offerings in the eyes of the networks. There was also a dearth of Latinos on their writing teams. Even while the National Hispanic Media Coalition, Imagen, the National Hispanic Foundation for the Arts, the National Council of La Raza, and other groups acted as television watchdogs in these years, they had less sway than groups such as Justicia or Justice in the 1970s, which I wrote about in chapter 3, and certainly less than the NAACP with regard to influencing the still white and male-dominated networks. New slide. Several of these series were star vehicles. After 1970s audiences responded so well to Freddie Prinze and Chico and the Man, the thought of a Latino star vehicle built around the perceived charms of a particular performer was no longer unthinkable. Maria Conchita Alonso, a Cuban-born Venezuelan actress who had appeared in Hollywood films such as Running Man, was given a chance to star in One of the Boys in 1989, while Edward James Olmos was able to negotiate a non-exclusive contract and creative control over his character on the uber-popular Miami Vice, which ran from 84 to 1990, after successes in theater and film. Despite the charms of these performers, their shows and the other Latino shows of the 80s and 90s didn't draw large enough audiences, and they had to be huge in these years because there were so few networks. And so they didn't draw enough audience to convince their networks to keep them on the air. And in truth, most of the series were flawed in various ways. Even so, there are still reasons to study them, as how they were bad is informative with regard to how Latino authorship and perspectives were stymied. Considering that these series were the primary attempts at creating Latino narratives and protagonists for television in these decades, peeling back these layers helps us understand the common assumptions being made in the industry about Latino cultures, appeal, creatives, and audiences. The 80s and 90s thus brought some optimism, but ultimately few changes for Latinos in television. It's somewhat surprising, as Latinos were becoming more visible in other realms of popular culture, especially film. A number of Latino-directed feature films, including Gregory Nava's El Norte and Luis Valdez's Zoot Suit, debuted to critical acclaim at film festivals and reached a national audience for the first time. Meanwhile, the African-American family sitcom The Cosby Show was a major hit for NBC. These developments encouraged some producers to pitch new series built around Latina or Latino performers that showed promise to appeal to a national audience. Latino writers were still typically not invited to contribute to these productions or to create their own series, however. Slide. The storylines of these series were different from one another, and this is actually just some of the series that had a short-lived run or a pilot in these decades. So these stories were all very different, but often rooted in a grab bag of universal comedy ideas rather than in Mexican-American or other Latino cultural histories or contemporary experiences. ABC's Condo, not even listed here, cast Cuban-American actor Luis Avalos of Electric Company fame as the patriarch of a middle-class Mexican-American family that clashes with the stuffy white upper-class couple in the condo next door. Comedy ensues, especially when their daughter marries the other family's son. I Married Dora, which is listed here, and the color picture on the far right is from I Married Dora. It starred the late Elizabeth Pena, a Cuban-American actress, as a refugee and doctor from El Salvador, who works as a nanny because she is not able to have a medical, her medical license in the United States. So she has to work as a nanny and marries her employer to avoid deportation. Afterward, she continues to work as the family nanny while she and her new husband try to ignore their mutual attraction. CBS's pilot and eventual TV movie Fort Figueroa, about a white Midwestern farm family that moves to a working class LA neighborhood, was sort of an East LA focused Beverly Hillbillies, as this white farming family suddenly finds themselves among people of color in downtown Los Angeles. And they're forced to question their cultural assumptions, and they get to know their Latino and Vietnamese neighbors. And one of the boys, which is listed here, but the photo was from on another page, that was the star vehicle for Maria Conchita Alonso. And it was likewise a culture clash romantic comedy about a Cuban Venezuelan free spirit who gets a job as a secretary for a construction company, only to fall in love with the owner, a white widower with 3 adult sons. It was a bland comedy that was promoted largely with emphasis on Alonso's beauty and body. And I also have here Sanchez of Bel Air, which is the image at the very top. And it must have been envisioned as a Latino Jefferson's. It was a comedy about a Mexican-American family that has moved on up from East LA to the Tony neighborhood of Bel Air. While it likely pleased some Latino viewers who wanted to see more images of Latino professionals, it had a generic feel and largely uncompelling characters. For the most part, these series were poorly written, poorly promoted, and not renewed after their season ended. As a case study, there's one show that I do feel had more promise than the others, and that was AKA Pablo. Next slide, please. And I was lucky to be able to interview Paul Rodriguez. I just mentioned that he had been in the play. He had written and starred in the play, The Pitch, in 2017. And this is back in 1984. So I was able to access materials linked to this TV series and interviews he had given over the years, as well as interviewing him myself. So it was within this era of misguided attempts that this series premiered, and it did underscore new possibilities for Latino subjectivity in television. A comedy about Paul Rivera, an up-and-coming stand-up comedian who lives with his large and colorful extended Mexican-American family. It was centered around Rodriguez, who also was beginning to reach a level of fame and success similar to his character, and he was a stand-up comedian. Norman Lear, for the most part, approached the creation of this series with more cultural sensitivity than previous non-Latino showrunners. He did hire at least one Latino writer, Jose Rivera, and invited 2 Latina consultants to provide some feedback in the development stage of the series. Apparently, the team also took pains to try to learn about Mexican-American life in Los Angeles. As Rodriguez describes in a 2007 interview with the American Comedy Archives, his first encounter with Lear was after a stand-up set at the LA Comedy Store. Impressed, Lear invited him in for a meeting. At the time, Lear had a 6-episode deal to try out a new series. He was thinking of remaking a show called Que Pasa USA, a Cuban-American family series produced by Miami Public Television station WPBT. And he was thinking of casting Rodriguez as one of the family members. Rodriguez declined, however, telling Lear that he was Mexican, not Cuban. They talked further about Rodriguez's family and Mexican-American cultural quirks, the fodder of much of his comedy at the time, and Rodriguez invited him to dinner at his parents' house so he could see for himself. Lear went and decided then to base his new series on Rodriguez's family, with Rodriguez as star. And so with Rick Mitz, Lear created AKA Pablo. It changed Rodriguez's life dramatically. As he stated in the Comedy Archive interview, it was a true story, as true as it could possibly be, about my family, how so many of us lived at home. And I went from nobody knew who the hell you were to, within a period of 6 months, my face was on the cover of TV Guide. Aside from Rodriguez, several Latino actors, but few of Mexican descent, were cast as Paul Rivera's family. They cast Italian-American actor Joe Santos and Mexican film actress Katy Morado as his parents, while Hector Elizondo, of Basque and Puerto Rican heritage, played his agent, Jose Sanchez / Joe Shapiro. Jose Rivera, a Puerto Rican screenwriter now known for The Motorcycle Diaries and On the Road, was hired as one of the writers. Although material from Rodriguez's stand-up comedy was at times included in the script, he strangely was not given a credit as writer. He also did not have executive producer status on the series, as we sometimes see for Latino TV stars today. In an unusual move, there were attempts on the part of Lear and Mitz to draw input from members of the cast and crew, including the Latina consultants mentioned earlier, on the storylines of the 6 episodes. Judith Mayerly, who also has done research on AKA Pablo, notes that NBC Television, Lear's company, was known for collaborative creative process in this phase. This had been the case for the Jeffersons and the original One Day at a Time. Despite this, the production's original vision of representing the perspectives of all of the members of a large and loving family disintegrated in this stage, with the eventual episodes focusing primarily on Paul and his stand-up comedy, and thus jokes about the foibles of Mexican-American culture. This shift was due largely to the writer's ideas of what would work and appeal in television comedy. More aware of the burden of representation that Mexican-American characters carried in 1984, the consultants voiced their concerns about narrative elements that bothered them, such as characterizing Paul's parents as foolish and out of step with US society. However, they ultimately had to accept that they would not change the minds of the writers. As one of the consultants, Dolores Sanchez, indicated to Mayerly, it was a compromise that I didn't willingly accept, but that I realized had to be made. I know how we Hispanics think, but it isn't always funny. I'd have writers telling me, well, you know, we have to do such and such thing because it will work on television. I couldn't very well dispute that. New slide. ABC and NBC Television appear to have put some money into initial promotion of the series and Rodriguez's star. They emphasize the colorful, chaotic excess of Pablo's family and Paul and Pablo's, and actually it's still one person, and Pablo's irreverent comedy about Mexican-American culture. Lear, in an appearance on Good Morning America on the day of the show's debut, March 6, 1984, described the series as representative of many Americans' experiences. This is about a large Mexican family, a Mexican-American family, at a time when 240 million Americans are desperate for some feeling of connection, of belonging. And here's a family with 16 people who would fight the world for each other, who love each other, and who belong to each other. It's a mirror of that new, fresh immigrant experience in our culture. The pilot introduces Paul/Pablo as his large and passionate family with whom he lives in East LA. The original credit sequence emphasizes the size and excitability of the family and moments when Rivera's work as a comedian, particularly a joke about the Mexican Express card, which amounts to putting a knife in his mouth as if he's a stereotypical undocumented immigrant wading through a river. Shots of Rodriguez as Paul outside in East LA are interspersed with random shots of Latinos in the city. We see Latino men stacking bags of oranges and playing baseball in the park, a young Latina holding a baby, and city residents walking past a mural in Monterey Park that pays tribute to Latin American revolutionary Che Guevara, who was embraced by the Chicano movement, emblazoned with, "We are not a minority." The credit sequence that opened later episodes is dramatically different, however. Let's see, next slide, please. And we won't play this right now, but it focused on Paul. Well, actually, if you could see if that will play for about a minute, let's try it. Thank you. So this gives you a sense of it. It focuses on Paul as a successful comedian. Oh, and I'm sorry, there's a later credit sequence even. I think it's the part that we didn't get to see just now at the very end. It's also shows him performing stand-up for a mostly white comedy club audience. He does the Mexican Express card and other jokes and physical comedy. He's vibrant, youthful, and a hit with his audience, shown laughing hard at his jokes. In the pilot, because Paul's a comedian who works late into the night at comedy clubs, he sleeps late in the day. Paul's mother and father argue. His mother wants to let Paul sleep, while his father feels he's not working while he's making fun of Mexicans. This discussion and the rest of the episode includes quite a bit of unsubtitled Spanish. Soon other family members, including multiple siblings, in-laws, and a niece and nephew, come in noisily and have to be reminded to let Paul sleep. To the extent of cliche, all are manual laborers and service workers. The father is a gardener. Pablo's brother works as a bricklayer and goes to night school. One sister cleans houses in Beverly Hills. Another works at Kmart, and his brother-in-law works at a gas station. We see that the family is at odds over Paul's comedy. One sister excitedly imitates it, which doesn't go over well with their father. Such an approach matched the complicated and conflictual family dynamics that livened and lent a sense of authenticity to other Lear family comedies. Paul, now awake, the family eagerly turns on the TV to see his latest appearance. Described by Entertainment Tonight as a new young Mexican comedian, a segment of his stand-up show was aired. On stage in front of a receptive audience, he performs part of a comedy set, first showing the many uses of a tortilla for Mexican Americans, including as a homemade Pac-Man and a 30-day deodorant. He does his Mexican Express card joke, much to his family's chagrin, but making the audience laugh. Soon Paul's new agent arrives, and Paul introduces him around the family. He teasingly describes them as the aristocrats and notes the gendered traditions they hold on to. Women in the family serve the men, he explains, and his mother is part of a crazy cult called the Sock Ironers. Jose shares his good news. Paul has been given money to create his own television show. The family celebrates with him, especially when they learn that he wants to spend the money on them. His father is still unhappy, however. He doesn't like Paul making fun of Mexicans. They argue about whether his father is treated with respect on his own job as a gardener. But the episode ends with a poignant reconciliation, and I believe that's the moment that we see right here in this photo. Paul learns that his father's reluctance for him to be a comedian is because Freddie Prinze's death by drug overdose in the 1970s. He doesn't want his son to have a life of hardship, and particularly not to die young. Finally understanding, Paul tells his father in Spanish that he loves him dearly, and they hug. When Paul later trips and falls face first into a plate of food, his father and the rest of the family laugh. Now, that's funny, his father says as the episode concludes. The self-reflexivity of the final joke conveys a clear affection for its characters. Similar humor and family dynamics guide the other 5 episodes. There also is some surprising content as well. The 4th episode is the only one to be credited to Jose Rivera. In The Presidential Joke Teller, Paul struggles with how to present himself when he has the opportunity to perform for US President Reagan. Next slide, please. And we won't show it just yet. I don't know that we have time. Am I supposed to go until 4 o'clock, or should I be wrapping up? No one behind the screen. I'll keep going. And so in this episode, The President's Joke Teller, his sister Sylvia convinces him against his father's wishes when he is going to perform for the president to dress in his regular clothes rather than a tuxedo to show that he's proud of where he comes from. Unfortunately, Paul and his agent end up getting pulled over on their way to the performance. They're jailed for speeding and then arrested and put in jail when the police don't believe that he's supposed to perform for the president. Actually, why don't we, if we can, let's just show this little bit.
But when I travel, people don't know who I am. That's why I carry.
Could you go to the second to 2538, please? And yeah, there are 2 different episodes on it. Yes, thanks.
Well, how do you like this Mexican kid, folks?
Oh, you're beautiful.
Can you believe it, me? Pablo Rivera, the son of Domingo and Rosa Maria Rivera, grandson to Rafael and Juanita Rivera, about to entertain the President of the United States.
When I see you this way, I believe it. Rosa, this is my silk handkerchief.
Really, Dad?
I have never blown my nose into it. But tonight you can.
Hola! Oh, I'm glad I got here in time. Oh, the buses from Beverly Hills were impossible tonight. An hour and 15 minutes it took me.
Oh, you did the Patterson House, Lucia.
Sí, mamá.
Ay, ve a tus hermanos.
Paul, I told Mrs. Patterson that my brother was entertaining the President of the United States tonight. And she told me to tell you to do a good job because the President loves the Hispanic people. And he wants us all to fulfill our potential. And then she told me to put the blue water in the toilet bowl so that I could fulfill my potential.
Where is he? Where's my famous brother-in-law? Míralo, there he is. Man, I told everybody about you. Oh, you look real handsome, Paul, man. I'm so proud of you.
What a day, what a day. I mean, this is the day that I shake the hand of the man who'll shake the hand of the President of the United States. And look at you. This calls for champagne.
You're right. I'm gonna buy you a beer. Come on.
Silvia, how come you look so unhappy? I thought you wanted me to do this.
I do, Paul, I do. But you know me, I want everything. I want this opportunity for you. But I can't help thinking Reagan is using you to make himself look better with Mexican voters. He doesn't really care about us.
Of course he cares. He's the president.
He's not my president.
Ah, this is my house. In my house, the president is the president.
Silvia, don't let him fool you. You know why Papa voted for Reagan? Because he likes his hairdo. He thought he was Chicano.
Not only that, Mr. Comedian.
Great, thank you. I just wanted to give everyone a sense of it. This is a show that's not available to watch. I was actually really lucky that someone gave me a copy that must have been videotaped from TV and then transferred at some point to digital. So to kind of bring us back to what this narrative addresses, so I mentioned that Paul gets convinced by the sister that just came in to wear street clothes rather than a tuxedo. And then he and his agent get arrested and they're in jail. And the episode includes a few moments of commentary from a distinctly Latino point of view, such as when family members argue about whether Reagan or any president has done anything to help Hispanics. And another moment when his brother-in-law Hector says, and you didn't get to see this part, but he says he knows after a night in jail that Mexicans aren't treated well there. And the episode's premise includes a deeper critique. Its emphasis on no one believing that Paul, a Mexican-American, would be asked to perform for the president. It slipped into jokes, as when Paul tells the police as he's being put in jail, there's a room of very important people waiting for us. They're Caucasians. It's hard to imagine a white writer coming up with the episode's spot-on understanding of the outsider identity that Latinos typically might experience in these years. Even more complex and pointed about Latino social issues was the whole enchilada, which skewered both television portrayals of Latinos and Latino media advocates who fight about them. Credited to Seth Greenland, the episode is set within the backdrop of the family getting ready for Paul's niece's quinceañera, which needs to impress their nosy neighbor, Senora Alvarez, played by the late, great Lupe Ontiveros. Meanwhile, Paul is offered a television series, but it's not all he had hoped for. This is because he's expected to play an undocumented immigrant named Pedro Enchilada, who lives in the backseat of his car, perhaps making fun of the flimsy premise of Chico and the Man in the 1970s. He and his parents and sister Sylvia are all crushed. In addition, the family is besieged by two members of a Chicano media advocacy group who say the series would be a disgrace to Mexican Americans. They are humorless and unresponsive to Paul's quips about it. Sylvia, in contrast, says he should do the series, adding, "You've got to get in on the inside to change things, and I know you will." Setting the decision aside, Paul sets up a family photo during the quinceañera, only to be interrupted by the media advocates. When the woman calls Paul a poor, foolish menso, a fool, for considering the series, Domingo, Paul's father, takes a stand. He shows them the door and slams it behind them, garnishing a cheer from the live audience. The family goes back to the photo, reveling in their posh appearance and earning shock and awe from Senora Alvarez. This prompts the first smile from Paul's mother, Rosa. As a whole, the episode is remarkable for the complexity of the commentary and clever humor as it addressed cultural nuances and divisions among Latinos, as well as ironies inherent in network attempts at Latino narratives. But by the date it aired, ABC had decided not to renew the series. The lore of this series is that it was canceled because of its ratings. Let's see, I am so sorry. This is a different spot. Yeah, the lore about AKA Pablo is that it was canceled because of its ratings. The pilot got an overnight share of 28, an impressive number, but a weekly rating of 14.9 with a 22% share, which in 1984 wasn't enough to sustain a network series. And it turns out also, I heard from Paul Rodriguez that some Mexican-American viewers were unhappy with the comedy that his character did on stage about Mexican Americans. And so there were some people who complained, whereas there were other Latino viewers who tried to keep the show on the air by doing a letter writing campaign. But it just wasn't enough. And so the show wasn't renewed. But I think it did have tremendous potential in its attempt to portray a Mexican American family in a more complicated way than we had seen before. Let's see, next slide, please. In the case of both AKA Pablo and First Time Out, which is the series featured here from 1995, it's one of my case studies because it was the first television series that had a female protagonist who also was not there simply as a mother and a housewife. And the star was Jackie Guerra. She is in the top left picture on the left. And most people might know her from having played Suzette in the Selena movie in 1997. And she was a stand-up comedian who was offered her own show as a kind of experiment. This is when the WB was just getting on the air, and they didn't quite know what their programming would be. And so they decided to give a Latina a chance to be the main character of a sitcom. But there were a lot of problems with it, as I write about. And so next slide, please. Could you put those bullet points up as well? Thank you. That's great. So in the case of both of these series, their productions included both well-meaning efforts and a privileging of proven writers, in effect, reiterating the status quo because the proven writers at that point in time were all generally white men. And in particular, their supposed knowledge of what comedy should be or what will really play on TV and be funny, that was usually privileged over what anyone who was Hispanic might say in terms of their own opinions of what they thought would be creating, interesting stories and characters. And so this idea of, who knows what good TV is was part of why we had these problems in this time period. And let's see, slide, please. We do begin to see shifts. And so I'm one thing that I can definitely say after doing this research is that bringing in Latino and Latino writers and also putting them within the higher position of being an executive producer of a series is what really has made a difference in what have sometimes been much more nuanced kinds of narratives. And so it really isn't until the very last years of the 1990s, and then especially the 2000s, that we begin to see this happen. The chapter in which I look at the 2000s and focus on George Lopez and Ugly Betty and Resurrection Boulevard really bring that home. But even those shows in the 2000s were really fettered by a desire to reach a primarily white audience and often also to create fairly generic Latino characters, or we might say pan-Latino characters, in which even though they may have been specified to be Mexican American or Puerto Rican or of another Latino origin group, they were kind of portrayed as just all the same. And so the two pictures that we see from the right that are from the 2010s, are showcasing a time when cultural specificity has become both more acceptable and I think more desirable as well. And so we often see very much more kind of clearly painted characters and narratives that are far less cliched. And so it's interesting to see the differences even between the 2000s and the 2010s. Next slide, please. So with George Lopez really being a turning point, and it's an interesting series in that George Lopez is one of the co-executive producers of the series. And he also drew on his own life quite a bit in terms of the construction of characters and some of the storylines. And those stories aren't all happy either. I mean, he's someone who's talked about having actually a fairly painful childhood. And I think that the fact that he is bringing in these truthful circumstances of his life, I think really did lend it a kind of new authenticity that we hadn't seen before. And it's not really tied to the fact that he's Mexican American. And so I think there are different ways in which this is kind of a typical American family, even while it's still a Latino family. And so it was definitely a kind of sea change from this show. Next slide. Vida would be an example of a 2010 show that also is very personal and intimate, and a show in which a Latina was given an opportunity to do whatever she wanted. And I mean, she was given a story and an already published narrative that she was asked to embellish and like make her own. So she didn't write all of it, but she very much had creative control and was able to hire her whole team as well, her whole creative team, which was primarily Latinas and queer Latinos, and a very diverse group as well. Next slide, please. And I think this is my last slide. Yes. And I would hail Los Spookies as well as another very creative, idiosyncratic series. It's humor, horror, or quirky. It's definitely a genre blend. And it's very much a completely different narrative than I think most of us would ever say we've experienced. And I wanted to bring in these images and narratives at the end to think about how far we've come. And I definitely wanted to go in depth to talk about that chapter on A.K.A. Pablo in the 80s to illuminate more of that. But I think that we've come a long way as well. And it's we may not need to just feel completely depressed about how things have been. So let me stop there. I look forward to answering questions and conversing more about the project, about the book.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Mary. It was really nice for me to hear you kind of go over some of the issues that you had written about to really reinforce some of the points that you've made. We do have a few questions that I think I'd like to start with. And then I have a number of topics that I'd like to bring up that you've highlighted, and also just that I noticed in the course of reading. But we can get into that discussion a little bit later. So I'm going to start out with a couple of questions actually by Carmen Monzon. So she asks something that she says, is there really no traction for these Latino shows? Because apparently she was a faithful watcher of all of them, only to see them being canceled way too soon for her taste and for her Latina heart. And she was wondering, was there any possibility that Latinos were sticking with Spanish language channels that were imported from the larger Spanish-speaking Americas? So what is the relationship? I mean, this comes up also with Ugly Betty, which of course is a remake of Betty La Fea. So maybe if you could talk a little bit about that.
Okay, so it sounds like there are a few different questions that are linked there. Well, I think that it depends on what era we're talking about. Things are really very different in the different decades. In the 80s and 90s, let's see, I'm trying to figure out where I want to start. I mean, there always will be an audience for Spanish language television. And so one of the things that I look at, and unfortunately, I didn't get to grow up fluent in Spanish. And so I'm personally not always able to go back and forth, but plenty of Latinos are bilingual and watch both Spanish and English language television, but studies and surveys of media usage of Latinos is finding that younger Latinos are less likely to tune into Spanish language television, and second, third, and fourth and beyond generation Latinos also are more likely to have English television be more the majority of their TV diet. And so certainly back in the 80s, the English language networks, I think, excuse themselves from trying very hard at creating programming with major Latino characters by saying, oh, well, Latinos don't tune in to our network, and that's why we don't need to try. Whereas now, as first, the Latino population is now 19% of Americans, and a larger proportion of Latinos are watching a lot of English language TV. It's, that doesn't really, things have changed a lot. And in terms of why shows aren't surviving, I think that one thing I found in different, throughout the decades is that when there have been shows with Latino major characters, they're promoted really poorly by the networks typically. And then even more in the last few decades, like I found that there was the same problem in 2000 as there was in 2014. As I talked to people that worked on Resurrection Boulevard, which was on Showtime, and Cristela Alonso, who was talking about her show Cristela, which was on ABC in 2014. In both cases, the promotion teams for the networks seem to have included no Latinos. So there's that issue too, like who promotes your show. And then they wanted to promote only in Spanish language venues, even though these are English language shows that will probably attract acculturated English speaking Latinos and non-Latinos that also speak English. So like Resurrection Boulevard, they wanted to market it on Spanish language radio stations. And so it actually took, the production team educating promotional teams to say, well, actually, you need to market in English language, spaces, because so there's just misunderstanding sometimes. The Cristela show also, they didn't do billboards in Los Angeles as is common for ABC shows. And so Cristela found out they wanted to only market on bus benches. And so their assumption was that Latinos are all having to ride buses, and that's how they were going to learn about the show. And so there are these things that mean that people don't hear about the shows. And I think at least the older shows, I think, were also very poorly written and just not interesting, actually. So they weren't always shows I would want to watch myself, even though I care about this. Yeah.
Well, Mary, we may be, you may be somewhat younger than I am, but somewhat of the same generation. And I certainly did not grow up speaking Spanish. So I do speak Spanish now. I had to learn it, but I would not seek out Spanish language TV. So I was always watching English language TV and was exposed to some of these, like Chico and the Man, definitely watched Chico and the Man. A lot of these I never knew about. I really had no idea. It was really fun to learn about them. But also, like, with regard to Cristela, like that was one that I must say, I hate watching network TV. And the reason I hate watching network TV is, one, because sometimes these shows aren't that well written, but also because the commercials, I can't stand the damn commercials. And, but I did watch Cristela because I liked it, and it was canceled. And it was a real disappointment to me, I have to say. So it's interesting to see that it was not properly promoted. So I want to pick up on something. There are a couple of other questions that I'll come back to. But it seems to me that well, first of all, let me thank you for doing the history. So because it's like in doing the history of like how Latino, any kind of Latino representation came into being, it's very helpful to see how certain stereotypes and, hard representations of what Latinos are either were there or were not there. The patterns of representation, how they were set up. So thank you. I know that's just work, and you did a lot of good 6 years worth of archival research. I'm very impressed by that. So thank you for doing that. And, so a couple of things struck me that Latinos end up being confined to comedy. So I can kind of see how that might happen. So, but then that means a lot of the real drama of our lives is completely missed. And also that we end up having to be funny, sexy, exotic, agreeable. So maybe if you could talk a little bit about those kinds of, how that came into being.
Yeah, no, I think it's very true. And, I think that being confined until recently to comedy, and in fact, one thing that has happened is that the comedy genre has evolved in television, and now dramedy is quite common and acceptable, and we often are looking for that, whereas until the early 1990s, the networks didn't really want dramedy. They wanted, at that time, especially if we think about it, this is the time of TV sets, and like they wanted to keep people on one network for a whole evening, and they typically would package sitcoms together and then maybe have a drama in their very last hour, or they might have a night of their serious dramas. And so it's almost like, the scheduling of primetime was kind of ghettoizing into certain spaces, and Latinos were not really deemed worthy of being part of a serious, bigger budget drama until the TV show Resurrection Boulevard. And I didn't get to talk about it today, but it was a Showtime series, as Showtime was trying to do original nuanced and more cinematic drama, just like HBO had started doing and doing very successfully. So The Sopranos in particular was this critical hit for HBO, and it brought them a lot of subscribers because you did have to pay more to get Showtime or to get HBO. And so, it's the year 2000 when Resurrection Boulevard, about a family of boxers and the sisters and aunts, and also who are not boxers but are very tied into all of it. That was a kind of another transitional TV show, I think, just like George Lopez was as well. And so let's see, what was the other part of the question about genre and?
Well, I don't even remember right now. I just, it's so interesting engaging with the different ideas. One thing that I would like to come back to and make sure and touch on that you brought up were these two very provocative, not provocative, but productive concepts. So one having to do with cultural citizenship, drawing on the work of Renato Zaldo and Rita Benmayor, as well as Ansaldua's idea of making faces. I love how you are taking Ansaldua's ideas of who is it that puts forward our faces? How do we allow ourselves to be seen? Since a lot of the problem that you're highlighting is that we often are not seen, or the lack of how we were seen then allows for Trump to come in and fill that up with rapists and criminals and stuff like that. So those two concepts are really interesting, particularly the cultural citizenship and the citizenship excess. So if you have, white people getting excess of citizenship, and you have Latinos sort of, and particularly because there are issues with citizenship for Latinos. So I don't know if you want to riff on that a bit.
Sure. It's not easy sometimes to articulate these dynamics because I think we get so used to them that we don't always think that there's something there to critique. But I think that Amaya's concept of citizenship excess, I wanted to have a way, to articulate, what it means that Latinos were left out of any creative positions for several decades in television. And it is linked very much, to education and, also struggling economically. It takes middle-class status for, young people to get to go to college and begin to potentially compete in creative professional arenas. And so, this idea of citizenship excess that Amaya uses is a good way to kind of think very succinctly about this idea that in actually probably in most regions and parts of the world, there is a kind of imbalance of who has agency and power and status and who is simply struggling to have a voice in the conversation. And so to me, to think about this kind of lack of power and agency, is I think really well illustrated with the concept of citizenship excess. Latinos are not we do not have any problem of excessive power and status, especially in popular culture and these money-making media industries. It's interesting, we could even look at Spanish language television and think about colorism in telenovelas. And so even though it's it's all Latinos, but which ones, and then which ones don't really have a representation and the ability to tell their stories. And
yeah. I think I've watched maybe one novela, and it was one of the rare ones that was focused on a maid. It was I'm forgetting the name of it, but it was interesting because the anti-indigeneity and the colorism that shows up in Spanish language TV is very marked as well. So it seems to me that your book probably would have been in press, if not out, when Joaquin Castro did his report from the General Accountability Office about the lack of representation of Latinos in media. So how did that strike you? Did it just make you feel like, yes, I knew this, I was doing this, or?
Oh, it made me
work with him, or,
It made me very appreciative that he cares about this subject and sees its impact, its significance for Latinos. And we need more people in political positions to champion the need for Latinos to be able to tell their own stories. And I think he's also interacted with a number of TV producers, including Tanya Saracho. We are seeing the contemporary Latina and Latino TV showrunners are much more was going to say activist, and maybe that is the right word, but certainly more vocal about the need for the industry to change, the need for the industry to admit that things are typically not changing enough. I think it's something that the TV showrunners of the 2000s, in a way, they were still just breaking in and probably felt that their positions were more precarious in the industry. But it just happens that the more recent showrunners are speaking out more, using social media. Gloria Calderon-Kellett, who's with One Day at a Time, and Tanya Saracho and some other professionals have formed an organization called Untitled Latinx Project. And, it is in part, working to put the word out, that there's a need for things to change, for Latino writers to be promoted more often, to get more opportunities, to not be only shoehorned into certain kinds of jobs. And so we will see. I mean, I'm hoping it will make a difference, that they really are much more vocal.
So on that note, Maggie's asking actually, and this probably wouldn't have been asked maybe 2 years ago, but certainly now. So why not Latinx TV? Why Latino TV?
That was raised to me, and partly it's because of experiences that I've had at UT Austin. As we, I co-founded the Latino Media Arts and Studies program within the College of Communication, the Moody College. And I was also speaking with my colleagues that run the Latino Studies departments on campus. And they did some surveys of students and were asking what terms they use and what they prefer. And there's a wide range of responses, as you would probably guess. But many of my students and their families still use the term Hispanic in Texas, and are just beginning to learn the term Latino. So Latinx. I mean, and there are surveys that show a lot of Latinos don't even know the term Latinx. Right. So I was a little nervous. You may have noticed that I use them all interchangeably, and that is how I try to speak to everyone and not make one term somehow the perfect term, which will never work. And
we'll keep changing. I did teach a Latinx or Latinx literature course last year. None of the students identified as Latinx. By the end, maybe a little bit, but actually at the time, the Pew research was like 3% of people of Spanish, so it's an ongoing issue, and it may be changing, but so one thing I kind of just want to highlight that is just coming through so clear with regard to the success of good writing for TV for Latino characters is cultural competence. Like, cultural competence is key. And that is what has been, foreshortened, denied, not hiring Latino writers, not hiring Latino showrunners. And it seems to be making the difference as we move into the 2010s, where we're starting to actually get Latino showrunners. So would you agree with that?
Absolutely. It's interesting because cultural competence is a term that I remember from when I was a social worker, because it was a term that we used to talk about interacting, like in a respectful and knowledgeable way with our clients of different backgrounds, and training people in a way that hopefully they would be able to do that and be that. And then as I was beginning to try to think about how I wanted to write about television that feels authentic. And I mean, I think there's a potential problem with the term authentic because it's defined by each one of us. What's authentic to me may be very inauthentic to someone else's experience. And so the term I ended up using was sincerity.
Oh, that's right.
And I was thinking about how I'm describing TV writers, and their process. And of course, I suppose cultural sincerity still could feel ignorant to another person. Like it's a little difficult, but I think cultural competence is a great way to think about also how it feels to the receiver.
Yes.
And I do think I sometimes feel like I feel when something feels sincere, but even more so to think about, well, they also seem knowledgeable about my family's cultural background. And so TV scholars, we're all still kind of grappling with how to write about this in a way that works for all of us. I appreciate you bringing that up. I think I'm going to borrow that.
Use it. No, I mean, because I'm working on a project right now that has to do with the exercise app. So how to create a phone-based exercise app. And we're doing a Latino narrative. It's actually kind of Mexican-American narrative because of all the issues having to do with like not making generic Latino. You kind of just have to choose one because, I mean, I'm sure you've had that experience. You watch TV shows and you've got a Mexican-American, obviously to us, Mexican-American character and his mother's Puerto Rican, and you can tell. And it's just like, you know, you realize that other people have very low standards for what is portrayed on you know, in the media for Latinos. But anyway, so yeah, I think a lot about these issues. So I want to ask you a question from Lynn Joyrich. She wants to ask about the contradictions around Desi Arnaz. In a way, I have a similar kind of question with the guy who plays, oh, I'm forgetting his name. You mentioned him. Miami Vice guy. Anyway, okay, but Desi Arnaz. Given that he was so central to the very founding solidification of the TV industry and TV conventions, really setting the terms for the sitcom I Love Lucy, and yet there was an absence of Latino representation of folks in the TV industry after him. And even his representation was, of course, riddled with problems as well as possibilities. Lynn says it's almost like a founding contradiction in TV with Latino at the very center of TV history, and yet Latinos also made absent. I'd love to hear your thoughts about this. Thanks.
That's a terrific question and observation. I only addressed Desi Arnaz in the introduction of the book, and in part because I have a whole chapter on him in my book, Latino Stars in U.S. Eyes, and I didn't want to just simply recreate what I had written in that other book. He's such an anomaly. I mean, that's basically how I do describe him. You know, certainly the first Latino TV professional, and in many ways, maybe the first Latino TV star as well. I mean, there were some Latinos. Anyway, I'm getting distracted. I think that he very much promoted himself to American audiences. You know, his career before television, you know, he begins in music and goes to theater and then goes to film. And his audiences were always mostly white American. And he also, you know, himself was fairly light-skinned. And, you know, so I really feel like he was treated, like in Hollywood films, as a foreigner, a white, but a primarily kind of white foreigner who could kind of deliver a sort of Latino delight because he was actually a great performer, musically and certainly charismatic. But I don't think that he had a strong interest in representing Cuban culture necessarily. And, I think that might have made him more palatable for the film and TV industries in the US. I don't think he challenged ideas of like mestizo Latinos in any way, really. But he's quite interesting.
Well, we're coming near to the end of our time. So I want to thank you, Mary. You've been terrific. This is a very important book. I certainly will refer back to it in my own scholarship. So thank you for writing it. And it's the kind of work we need. We need to, highlight the existence of Latinos. We are some 20% of the population of the United States. And we buy, what is it? Chicano babies pee. Right. Right. Okay, so thank you so much. I don't know if you want to have anything you want to close with.
No, I really appreciate to know that the book is getting out there, and I'm just thrilled to be able to share it. And thank you so much. Yeah.